The last service. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Whitmore estate as Margaret stood frozen in the center of the grand dining room, her hands trembling as she held the delicate china teacup. The weight of everyone's stares pressed down on her shoulders like lead, but none more heavily than the disappointed gaze of Mr. Harrison, the family patriarch, whose pointing finger felt like a sword piercing her heart. The morning had begun like any other in her 15 years of service to the Whitmore family. Margaret had risen before dawn in her tiny attic room, the floorboards creaking under her feet as she dressed in the familiar blue uniform with its pristine white apron. She had descended the narrow servants' staircase to begin her daily routine, lighting the fires, preparing breakfast, ensuring that every surface gleamed with the perfection expected in one of Boston's most prestigious households. She remembered standing in the kitchen, polishing the silver service that would grace the table where the city's most powerful men would dine. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She had labored over every fork, every knife, every spoon that would be used at the very gathering where her world would come crashing down. "Explain this," Harrison's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unforgiving. The assembled guests, politicians, businessmen, society's elite, watched with the hungry anticipation of vultures circling wounded prey. Margaret's throat constricted. The blue uniform that had once made her feel dignified now felt like a costume of shame. The white apron, starched and pristine that morning, seemed to mock her now. She had served the Whitmore family faithfully since she was 17, fresh off the boat from Ireland with nothing but hope and calloused hands willing to work. Those early days felt like a lifetime ago. She remembered stepping off the ship at Boston Harbor in 1887, clutching her father's letter of introduction to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a distant cousin who had promised employment sight unseen. The city had overwhelmed her, the noise, the smoke from countless chimneys, the press of humanity unlike anything in her small village in County Cork. But the Whitmore mansion had been a sanctuary of sorts. Grand beyond her imagination, with its soaring ceilings and imported furnishings, it had also been orderly and predictable. She learned quickly, adapting to the rigid hierarchy of domestic service, earning the grudging respect of the other staff through diligence and determination. Mrs. Whitmore, though demanding, had been fair in those early years. She had seen potential in the quiet Irish girl who never complained and always completed her tasks thoroughly. Margaret had been promoted from scullery maid to parlor maid, then to lady's maid, and finally to the trusted position of head housemaid, a remarkable ascent for someone of her background. I don't understand, sir," she whispered, though deep in her heart, she knew exactly what this was about. James Whitmore Jr. stepped forward, his expensive suit immaculate, his dark hair perfectly styled, but his eyes, those eyes that had once looked at her with such tenderness in stolen moments, now held nothing but cold calculation. At 28, he was considered one of Boston's most eligible bachelors, heir to a shipping fortune that had weathered economic storms and emerged stronger with each passing year. "Tell them about the letters, Margaret." The letters. Margaret's heart clenched as she thought of them, those beautiful, impossible missives that had transformed her mundane existence into something magical. The first had been simple, left folded on her work table in the linen closet where she inventoried the household goods. "Dear Margaret, it had begun, I hope you won't think me forward, but I wanted to thank you for your kindness to my aunt during her recent illness. Your gentle care did not go unnoticed." She had thought little of it initially, a polite acknowledgement from a member of the family was unusual but not unheard of. But then there had been another, and another, each one more personal than the last. James had begun sharing his thoughts about the books he was reading, his concerns about the family business, his dreams of traveling to places beyond Boston's rigid social boundaries. The teacup rattled against its saucer in her shaking hands. Letters. Those beautiful, impossible letters he had written to her over the past year. Letters filled with promises of a different life, of love that transcended the boundaries of class and station. Letters she had treasured like precious gems, reading them by candlelight in her tiny attic room, dreaming of a future that could never be. Their correspondence had evolved slowly, cautiously. Margaret had been careful at first, responding with proper deference and maintaining appropriate boundaries. But James had been persistent, and gradually, carefully, he had drawn her out. She had begun sharing stories of her childhood in Ireland, her memories of parents who had sacrificed everything to give her a chance at a better life in America. The first time they had spoken face to face, truly spoken, not just the polite exchanges required by their respective positions, had been in the mansion's library late one evening. Margaret had been dusting the shelves when James had entered, claiming to be looking for a particular book. Instead of the brief, formal interaction she expected, he had engaged her in conversation about the volumes surrounding them. "Have you read much Dickens?" he had asked, and when she admitted she had, his face had lit up with genuine interest. They had talked for nearly an hour about great expectations, about themes of social mobility and the corruption of wealth, about the possibility of love transcending class boundaries. It was dangerous territory, but Margaret had found herself intoxicated by the intellectual stimulation, by being seen as more than just a pair of hands to perform menial tasks. James had treated her thoughts as valuable, her opinions as worthy of consideration. "What letters, Master James?" The words came out strangled, desperate. But she knew. They all knew. In this world of rigid social hierarchies and unforgiving expectations, love was a luxury reserved for equals, and she, a mere servant girl, had committed the unpardonable sin of believing herself worthy of love from above her station. The progression from intellectual companionship to something deeper had been gradual but inevitable. James had begun seeking her out during her duties, finding excuses to be wherever she was working. Their conversations had grown more intimate, moving beyond books and ideas to personal revelations and shared dreams. The first time he had told her she was beautiful had been in the conservatory, where she was tending to Mrs. Whitmore's prized orchids. The late afternoon sun had been streaming through the glass walls, and James had appeared as if from nowhere, watching her work with an expression she had never seen before. "You have the most graceful hands," he had said quietly, and when she had looked up, startled, he had continued, "Everything you touch seems to bloom under your care." Margaret had tried to maintain proper boundaries, reminding him of the vast gulf between their stations, but James had been persuasive. He had spoken of a changing world, of the possibility that the old rules might not apply forever. He had painted pictures of a future where love mattered more than lineage, where two people who truly understood each other could build a life together regardless of their backgrounds. Looking back, Margaret could see how naive she had been, how desperately she had wanted to believe in the fairy tale he was spinning. But in those moments, caught up in the intoxicating possibility of being loved for herself rather than her utility, she had allowed herself to hope. Mrs. Whitmore emerged from the crowd of onlookers, her face a mask of aristocratic disdain. Eleanor Whitmore had aged gracefully into her 50s, her silver hair always perfectly coiffed, her clothing representing the height of fashion and expense. She had been Margaret's employer for 15 years, and until this moment, Margaret had believed there was mutual respect between them. "We found them in your room, dear," she said, the endearment dripping with venom. "Such passionate words from my son. Such inappropriate correspondence." Margaret's world tilted. They had searched her private quarters, violated the one small space she could call her own. The letters, her only proof that what had passed between her and James was real, that the whispered conversations in darkened hallways and stolen kisses in the garden weren't just figments of her desperate imagination, were now evidence of her disgrace. The violation felt complete and devastating. Her room, tucked away in the servants' quarters under the eaves of the great house, had been her sanctuary. It was small, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings, but it had been hers. The dormer window looked out over the garden where she and James had shared their most intimate moments, and she had often sat on the windowsill reading his letters by moonlight. Now she imagined Mrs. Whitmore and perhaps the housekeeper going through her few possessions with clinical detachment, reading the words that had meant everything to her, reducing her most precious memories to evidence of moral failing. "The scandal this could cause," Harrison continued, his voice booming across the room. Harrison Whitmore was a man who had built his empire through shrewd business dealings and careful cultivation of social connections. At 73, he remained formidable, his presence commanding respect and fear in equal measure. "The damage to our family's reputation. To think that a servant in our employ would scheme to entrap my grandson with false affections." Margaret understood now why this confrontation was taking place in front of the assembled dinner guests. This wasn't just about punishing her, it was about demonstrating to Boston's elite that the Whitmore family would not tolerate any threat to their social standing, no matter how small. Her public humiliation served as a warning to others and a demonstration of the family's commitment to maintaining proper order. The guests represented the cream of Boston society: railroad barons, textile magnates, shipping merchants, and their carefully selected political allies. These were the people who shaped the city's destiny, who decided which families would rise and which would fall from grace. Their approval was essential to the Whitmore family's continued prominence, and Margaret's relationship with James threatened that carefully cultivated reputation. False. The word escaped Margaret's lips before she could stop it. False, sir. For the first time, she looked directly at James. Really looked at him. The man who had told her she was beautiful, who had traced the lines of her face with gentle fingers, who had promised to find a way for them to be together despite the impossibility of it all. The man who had made her believe that love could conquer the insurmountable walls of social convention. She remembered the evening just 2 weeks ago when he had met her in the garden after the household had retired. The autumn air had been crisp, and he had wrapped his coat around her shoulders as they walked among the roses. He had spoken of his plans to approach his father about their relationship, about his belief that Harrison might be persuaded to accept their union if it were presented properly. "I know it won't be easy," he had said, his arm around her waist as they stood beneath the oak tree where they had shared their first kiss. "But I'm willing to fight for us, Margaret. You're worth fighting for." She had believed him. God help her, she had believed every word. But now she saw the truth in his averted gaze, in the set of his jaw, in the way he stood with his family against her. He had never meant any of it. To him, she had been nothing more than a diversion, a temporary amusement to fill the boring hours of his privileged life. "They weren't false to me," she whispered, more to herself than to the room. The older gentleman in the gray vest, she recognized him as Judge Aldrich, a family friend and frequent dinner guest, shook his head sadly. "Such delusions are common among the servant class, I'm afraid. They mistake kindness for affection, proper treatment for romantic interest." Judge Aldrich had always been condescending toward the household staff, treating them as if they were amusing curiosities rather than human beings with thoughts and feelings. His words now carried the weight of legal and social authority, reducing her year of happiness to a psychological delusion requiring correction. Margaret felt something die inside her chest, some essential part of her hope withering like a flower in winter. She thought of her parents, who had worked themselves to death on a failing farm in Ireland so that their daughter might have better opportunities in America. They had dreamed of her finding security and perhaps even modest prosperity in the New World. What would they think of her now? Their daughter, who had allowed herself to be seduced by impossible dreams, who had forgotten the fundamental truth they had tried to teach her, that people like them were born to serve, not to aspire beyond their station. She set the teacup down on the nearest table with hands that no longer trembled. They had moved beyond shaking to a kind of hollow steadiness that came with the death of dreams. "I never asked for anything," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the marble expanse with surprising strength. "I never demanded money or position. I never threatened to expose anything. I simply loved." The word hung in the air like a confession of guilt. In this room full of calculated marriages and strategic alliances, where emotion was secondary to advantage and passion was considered a dangerous weakness, love itself had become an indictment. Margaret thought of the marriages she had observed during her years in service. She had seen how these unions were arranged like business mergers, with dowries negotiated and bloodlines evaluated like livestock pedigrees. She had witnessed the quiet desperation of women trapped in loveless matches, the casual infidelities of men who viewed their wives as social accessories rather than companions. Against this backdrop of emotional sterility, what she and James had shared, or what she had believed they shared, seemed almost revolutionary in its simplicity and honesty. Love. Mrs. Whitmore practically spat the word. "You love the idea of elevating yourself above your proper place. You love the notion of wealth and status that could never rightfully be yours." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be credible. Margaret couldn't deny that she had been dazzled by the possibility of escaping the narrow confines of domestic service, of having a voice in conversations that mattered, of being seen as more than just another piece of household equipment. But that wasn't what had drawn her to James initially. It had been his kindness, his intelligence, his apparent ability to see past the artificial barriers that separated them. She had fallen in love with the man who discussed literature with genuine enthusiasm, who listened to her opinions with respect, who treated her as an equal despite the vast differences in their circumstances. Or had she? Now, faced with his betrayal and the cold reality of her situation, Margaret found herself questioning everything. Had she been in love with James himself, or with the idea of being loved by someone like him? Had she confused gratitude for his attention with genuine affection? The uncertainty was almost worse than the heartbreak. Margaret looked around the room at these people, these powerful, influential people who shaped the fate of nations and commanded the respect of thousands, and saw them for what they truly were. Small, petty, so terrified of losing their carefully constructed world that they would destroy an innocent girl to preserve it. The irony was that she posed no real threat to their established order. Even if James had defied his family and married her, the social structure that elevated them would have remained intact. One romantic rebellion wouldn't have toppled the entire system of privilege and inheritance that kept them at the top of Boston's hierarchy. But perhaps that was precisely why her situation was so dangerous to them. If one servant girl could aspire to love beyond her station, if one member of their class could choose affection over advantage, it might inspire others to question the supposedly natural order of things. I loved him, she said simply. Just him. Not his money, not his name, not his position. I would have loved him if he were as poor as I am. James flinched at her words but didn't speak. Couldn't speak, perhaps, or wouldn't. The distinction no longer mattered. Margaret could see the conflict in his expression, guilt warring with self-preservation, regret battling with social conditioning. But his silence spoke louder than any words could have. In that moment, she realized that James was as much a prisoner of his circumstances as she was of hers. He had been raised from birth to believe that his value lay in his family's wealth and status, that his identity was inseparable from his inheritance. The idea of choosing love over social position probably terrified him more than it attracted him. But understanding his weakness didn't excuse it, and it certainly didn't lessen the pain of his betrayal. "Pack your things," Harrison commanded. "You have 1 hour. After that, security will escort you from the grounds. And Margaret," his voice softened to something almost resembling pity, "don't think about seeking employment with any of our friends or associates. Word travels fast in our circles." The threat was clear and devastating. In Boston's tightly knit world of wealthy families, the Whitmores' disapproval would be enough to blacklist her from domestic service entirely. Without references, without recommendations, she would be unable to find work in any respectable household. At 32, with no other marketable skills and no savings to speak of, domestic servants were paid modestly and expected to be grateful for room and board. She was being condemned to destitution. The alternatives available to women in her position were few and grim. Factory work that would break her body and spirit, taking in washing or sewing for pennies, or worse possibilities she didn't want to contemplate. Margaret nodded once, accepting her fate with a dignity that seemed to shame some of the onlookers. She had expected this outcome from the moment she saw Harrison's pointing finger, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at James one final time. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember the man she had thought she loved, the one who had written about wanting to travel the world, who had expressed frustration with the limitations of his privileged but restrictive life, who had seemed to genuinely value her thoughts and opinions. "I meant what I said in my letters," she told him softly. "Every word. I hope someday you'll remember that someone loved you for who you were, not what you possessed." The words were both a gift and a curse. She was offering him the memory of being truly loved while simultaneously forcing him to confront what he was throwing away. In years to come, when the passion of youth had faded and he found himself trapped in a marriage of convenience, he would remember her words and know exactly what he had sacrificed for social acceptability. As she walked toward the servants' entrance, her back straight despite the weight of her broken dreams, Margaret could hear the whispered conversations resuming behind her. The scandal would be forgotten within days, buried under more pressing social concerns. The Whitmore family would emerge unscathed, their reputation intact, perhaps even enhanced by their decisive handling of a potentially damaging situation. But the cost of that protection would be higher than they knew. James would carry the memory of this moment for the rest of his life, and it would poison every relationship that followed. He would never again be able to love freely, never again trust that his emotions weren't being manipulated by someone seeking advantage. In her tiny attic room, Margaret packed her few belongings with mechanical precision. Each item told a story of her years in the Whitmore household. The photograph of her parents back in County Cork, dead now these 10 years from the fever that had swept through their village. Her mother's rosary, worn smooth by countless prayers and brought across the ocean as one of the family's few precious possessions. The small Bible her father had pressed into her hands as she boarded the ship to America, convinced he would never see his daughter again. There were other mementos too, a pressed flower from the garden where she and James had walked, a program from the concert series she had been allowed to attend in her role as Mrs. Whitmore's companion, a small silver thimble that had been a Christmas gift from the household staff during her 5th year of service. Each object represented hopes and dreams that now lay in ruins. The pressed flower spoke of romance that had been revealed as delusion. The concert program reminded her of cultural experiences she would never again be able to afford. The thimble symbolized the domestic skills that had been her pride and would now be her only marketable asset in a hostile world. At the bottom of her trunk, beneath her other uniform and spare undergarments, she found the letters. The housekeeping staff had taken them, read them, probably passed them around for entertainment before delivering them to their employers as evidence of her crime. But here they were, returned to her like artifacts of an archaeological dig, proof of a civilization that had never really existed. She held them for a moment, feeling the weight of her foolishness in the smooth paper. James's handwriting was elegant, educated, the penmanship of someone who had received the finest tutoring money could buy. The ink was expensive, the paper of quality that cost more than she earned in a week. My dearest Margaret, *1 began, you cannot know how I treasure our conversations. In a world full of artificial pleasantries and calculated exchanges, your honesty is like fresh air to someone who has been suffocating. When I am with you, I remember what it feels like to be genuine, to say what I mean rather than what is expected. Another read. I find myself counting the hours until I can see you again. Your smile has become the brightest part of my day, and your laugh haunts my dreams. I know the obstacles we face seem insurmountable, but I believe that love, true love, can overcome any barrier. And perhaps most painfully, I have been thinking of ways we might build a life together. Perhaps we could travel west, where the old social distinctions matter less, where a man and woman can be judged on their character rather than their bloodlines. Would you be willing to start fresh with me, Margaret? To leave behind everything familiar for the chance at happiness together? Reading them again, Margaret could see how carefully crafted they were, how they offered just enough hope to keep her emotionally invested while making no concrete commitments. Had James been consciously manipulating her, or had he simply been swept up in the romance of forbidden love without considering the practical consequences? The answer didn't matter now. The result was the same either way. Then, with steady hands, she carried them to the small fireplace in her room and fed them one by one to the flames. The beautiful words, "My dearest Margaret, you are the light in my darkest moments," curled and blackened and crumbled to ash. Watching them burn, Margaret felt a strange sense of liberation. The physical destruction of the letters seemed to free her from the spell they had cast, allowing her to see clearly for the first time in months. She had been living in a fantasy, and while awakening from it was painful, it was also necessary. As the last letter burned, Margaret allowed herself one moment of grief. She sat on the narrow bed where she had dreamed of a different life and wept for the girl who had been naive enough to believe that love could bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle. She wept for the man who was too weak to stand up for what his heart had wanted, even if only for a moment. She wept for a world so rigid and cruel that it would destroy tenderness wherever it found it blooming in unexpected places. But her tears were not only for what she had lost. They were also for what she had never really had. The genuine love and respect she had thought James felt for her, the security and belonging she had imagined were within her grasp, the future that had never been more than an illusion. When her crying was finished, she felt empty but somehow cleaner, as if the tears had washed away the last remnants of her delusions. She dried her face with the rough towel from her washstand and looked at herself in the small mirror that hung above it. The woman looking back at her was 32 years old, with premature lines around her eyes from years of early mornings and late nights. Her brown hair, usually pinned back in a neat bun, had come loose during her emotional breakdown and framed her face in unruly waves. Her blue eyes, once bright with hope and dreams, now held a kind of weary wisdom. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, she realized. Whatever James had seen in her, or claimed to see, it hadn't been the kind of striking loveliness that inspired men to defy social convention. She was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of woman who could disappear into a crowd without anyone noticing. Perhaps that had been part of the attraction for James. She had posed no real threat, made no impossible demands. She had been grateful for his attention, flattered by his interest, willing to love him without requiring him to sacrifice anything meaningful in return. Then she dried her tears, straightened her shoulders, and picked up her trunk. Tomorrow she would find a way to survive. She would take whatever work she could find, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, anything honest that would put food in her belly and a roof over her head. She would rebuild her life from nothing, as she had done once before as a frightened teenager in a strange land. The comparison to her younger self was both encouraging and sobering. She had been 17 when she arrived in America, with energy and optimism that seemed inexhaustible. She had believed that hard work and good character would eventually be rewarded, that America truly was a land where anyone could rise above their circumstances. Now she was older, wiser, and infinitely more cynical. She understood that the American dream was available only to those who started with certain advantages, that the barriers between social classes were as rigid here as they had been in Ireland, just disguised by democratic rhetoric and myths of opportunity. But she also had resources now that her younger self had lacked. She had 15 years of experience in one of Boston's most demanding households. She could manage complex domestic operations, supervise other staff, handle delicate social situations. Surely those skills had value somewhere, even without the Whitmore family's recommendation. But she would never again make the mistake of believing that someone like her could be loved by someone like him. That lesson, burned into her heart like a brand, would stay with her forever. The resolution felt like both a loss and a liberation. She would never again risk her heart so carelessly, never again allow herself to be swept away by romantic fantasies. But she would also never again be vulnerable to the kind of devastation she was experiencing now. As Margaret walked down the grand staircase one final time, her footsteps echoing in the vast marble foyer, she didn't look back. The familiar spaces that had been her world for 15 years, the elegant drawing rooms where she had arranged flowers, the library where she and James had first truly connected, the conservatory where he had first called her beautiful, felt like memories from someone else's life. Behind her, the party was resuming, the guests already forgetting the small drama they had witnessed. The crystal chandelier still cast its dancing light, the imported wine still flowed, the conversation still sparkled with wit and malice. Within an hour, her name would be forgotten, her story reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of servants who forgot their place. But something had changed in that room, some innocence had been sacrificed on the altar of social propriety. In their zeal to protect their world from contamination by genuine emotion, the Whitmores had revealed the hollowness at its heart. Margaret stepped out into the cold November night, carrying everything she owned in a single trunk. The city sprawled before her, vast and indifferent, full of dangers and uncertainties. Gas lamps flickered in the wind, casting moving shadows on the cobblestone streets. Somewhere in those shadows, she would have to build a new life. But also, perhaps, full of possibilities for a woman brave enough to start over. She had survived the death of her parents, the trauma of immigration, and 15 years in domestic service. She would survive this too. Behind her, in the warmth and light of the mansion, James Whitmore Jr. stood at the window of his father's study, watching her small figure disappear into the darkness. His hand pressed against the glass as if he might reach through it too. Call her back, to tell her he was sorry, to explain that he had been a coward when courage was what love demanded. The whiskey in his glass remained untouched as he wrestled with emotions he had no words to express. Guilt, certainly, but also a profound sense of loss that surprised him with its intensity. He had expected to feel relieved once the situation was resolved, but instead he felt as if something essential had been torn away from him. But he didn't call out. He didn't run after her. He simply watched until she was gone, then turned back to face his family and the life they had chosen for him. Within 6 months, he would be engaged to Catherine Morrison, daughter of a textile magnate and perfect match for his social position. Their wedding would be the social event of the season, written up in all the newspapers, attended by everyone who mattered in Boston society. Years later, when Margaret's name had faded from memory in the halls of the Whitmore estate, When James had settled into the comfortable numbness of an arranged marriage and social expectations, he would sometimes find himself standing at that same window, looking out into the night and wondering what had become of the woman who had loved him without conditions or calculations. Catherine would prove to be exactly what his family expected: beautiful, well-educated, socially adept, and completely uninterested in her husband's inner life. Their marriage would produce 2 children and maintain perfect appearances while remaining emotionally sterile. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed him, he would remember the weight of Margaret's faith in him, the light in her eyes when she looked at him as if he were capable of greatness. He would remember, and he would know exactly what he had lost when he chose safety over love, status over truth. But by then, of course, it would be too late for anything but regret. The last service had been performed, and its memory would haunt the halls of that grand house long after the marble had cracked and the crystal had dimmed, a ghost of what might have been if courage had triumphed over fear, if love had proven stronger than the prison of social convention. In the end, Margaret had been right about one thing: she had loved him for who he was, not what he possessed. The tragedy was that James Whitmore Jr. had never learned to do the same for himself. He would spend the rest of his life being loved for his wealth, his position, his usefulness to others, but never again for the man he might have been beneath all the expectations and obligations. Margaret, walking alone through the dark streets of Boston with her trunk and her shattered dreams, at least carried with her the knowledge that she had loved truly and completely, without calculation or reservation. It was a gift that would sustain her through the difficult years ahead, even as it served as a reminder of everything she had lost.